I thought I would talk about democracy in a strange way, but it does make sense. It is all going to link together. But I thought I would talk about democracy because direct action as a strategy is a strategy of direct democracy. So it's a strategy for essentially, anarchist inspired strategy that essentially tries to bypass the obstacles of mainstream politics, particularly, state politics, and bypass all of the frameworks that typically use violence to keep people in line, and instead establish a format, a structure in which people willingly collaborate, right? So the kind of fundamental principle of direct action is that the form of mainstream politics has failed, particularly in this case, in an extreme case where we're watching the genocide and we know that British factories are contributing to that genocide. Rather, Elbit factories in Britain are contributing to that genocide. And the political process has completely failed in every aspect to stop it. All right. And I also wanted to talk about democracy because I think one of the reasons that Palestine Action has become so successful lately is because Britain is going through a real crisis of democracy in on several levels. One is, I think, maybe the most obvious one, as Hayat just mentioned, is the treatment of protesters. Jonathan Flux also, of course, mentioned Jonathan Fluxman, sorry, mentioned our rights to protest under Articles 10 and 11 of the European Convention. The British state has not only introduced new legislation to severely restrict our rights to protest, but is also, even in the extremely broad legislation that exists already, has completely misused it. All right. So in the case of the Filton 18, who were initially arrested under terrorism charges, it doesn't look like any of them will actually be tried under terrorism charges, which is at least a small positive. But they were arrested on terrorism charges. Now, that misuse of terrorism, anti-terrorism legislation is so egregious that the UN has intervened twice, has written two reports criticizing the British government for misuse of anti-terrorism legislation, leading to severe restrictions on freedom of speech, and ultimately really undermining the judicial process itself. Because obviously those charges were intended for purely terrorism cases. Now they've sort of introduced a new category that they're calling terrorism related. So they're trying to insinuate that Palestine Action in some way has a relationship to terrorism. The point is that that legislation has been used to so clearly stifle freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of protest, and then create also a chilling effect, because now, as soon as people hear a reference to terror legislation, their willingness to engage in protest is going to be severely reduced. And on top of all this, we have, a completely parallel system of organizations like UK Lawyers for Israel. And I'm sure many of you will be very familiar with the fact that, we're in a situation now where even the most basic expression of solidarity with the Palestinian people from, say, a theater group, from a student group, is going to result in possibly legal challenges. Even saying the word genocide in a public forum, saying the word resistance in a public forum, saying the phrase from the river to the sea, you risk arrest, okay, because of this extreme heightened sense of, again, I think, mischaracterization of terrorism. So this is one area that I think we have a crisis of democracy, in that even the democratic systems that are supposed to protect us now, whether we really have faith in the state's democratic systems to protect us or not, is a much longer debate. but at least I think for many years, there was the veneer of efficiency in those systems. There was the veneer of respectability. That's more or less gone out the window, which I think is one of the reasons why we're seeing in opinion polls, sort of record low public faith in politicians and mainstream political institutions. The other way in which I would say democracy is in crisis is in the sort of the formal machinations of democracy that most people think of. Okay, in other words, our right to affect the political future of our country through not only voting, of course, that's the most obvious form, but also sort of democratically sanctioned forms of dissent. So writing to your MP, lobbying, holding a demonstration, signing a petition. We're also seeing that, again, in the face of Israel's genocide now, almost all of those, I mean, those mechanisms have almost, I don't want to dissuade people, of course, but they have more or less failed in the sense they have failed to stop, to achieve the most basic goal, which is to stop, at least to stop British arms sales to Israel. And again, I think that deterioration of our ability to participate in democracy is another reason why the British public has so little faith in the political system now. Okay, adding to then of course there's the added layer of a sort of subjective analysis of those political parties. The fact that there is no daylight between the position of the Labour Party and the Tories with regards to Gaza. The fact that on most other serious issues, it's very hard to distinguish the difference. Okay, so even our so-called opposition parties, the kind of two-party system, has folded in on itself now to the point where we really can't talk about two opposing ideologies. They're almost perfectly aligned. So the irony is, I think, that only a few years ago, this country was able to produce and to great effect, and also to great fanfare, this country was able to produce some very effective autonomous networks of direct democracy. And what I'm talking about here is the mutual aid system that was developed around the pandemic, right? So the fact that many people in neighborhoods were immediately able to coalesce. They were able to go to local supermarkets, ask for extra food that wasn't being sold to be given to them for free. And then, we rode around on our bikes and gave that food out for free to people who were in need and who had no ability to leave the house, with absolutely zero intervention from the state. Now, those mutual aid groups, of course, were eventually celebrated by the mainstream and by the state. I would argue more because it was able to alleviate their responsibility for welfare, their responsibility for the health of their citizens. But regardless, so what we know is that those kind of autonomous direct democracy networks are not only possible, but can be built very effectively. Now, what does all of this have to do with direct action? Well, direct action uses and builds precisely those kind of autonomous networks, okay, from the ground up, that are self-administrating and that don't require whether the infrastructure or the approval of the state. This is perhaps the biggest difference between direct action and other forms of protest, is that other forms of protest require a permit to hold a demonstration, for example, a permit to hold a rally. By signing a petition, you're asking the state for permission to respect your opinion. Direct action says that we won't ask for permission. We'll simply take the action ourselves and defy the state and ask the state to try and stop us. One of the reasons why direct action against Israeli weapons manufacturers is particularly interesting is that it goes back again to crisis of democracy, which is that the state's own position on continuing to produce Israeli munitions and exporting them from this country does not align at all with the British public's position. So on many polls, particularly after this phase of Israel's genocide, you're finding about 60% to 3/4 of the British public who believe there should be an arms embargo against Israel. So groups like Palestine Action are simply saying, number one, their position represents the position of the British people. So this is a form of democracy. And number two, it's really demanding the most basic adherence to even British law, because British law for exports says that if there's any risk that exports, and this is particularly for arms exports, will be used in war crimes, or will be used even to prolong a conflict, that those licenses should be rejected. That's clearly not happening, right? There is beyond even the possibility of risk that munitions from this country, that weapons components will be used in war crimes. So that's clearly been laid out over Israel's 75-year history. So even by the UK's own standards, they're not adhering to their own law. So while it's often, direct action against Israeli weapons manufacturers is often presented as a radical form of protest, the demands are in fact extremely consistent with existing British law, existing international law, and the will of the people in Britain. The reason I find this form of direct democracy also particularly exciting is that it responds to an international movement that is also turning to exactly the same forms of direct democracy. And the one for me that I find most inspiring is the first Intifada in Palestine, in which local groups, local villages set up firstly autonomous self-defense units. They then became units that took the fight directly to the occupation. And this was, don't forget, in the first Intifada, this was largely unarmed forms of direct action against the occupation. So it was able to form autonomous groups from the ground up with an incredibly broad base of support. At the same time, it was also able to challenge many of the structures within Palestinian society that people felt was holding them back. So, for example, the first Intifada was devised, at least in the beginning, fully outside of the Palestinian Authority. It had no relationship to the Palestinian Authority. These were autonomous groups. Similarly, women took a very prominent leadership role in the first Intifada, so they were able to challenge also many of the patriarchal traditions that they found themselves faced with in Palestine. And where we find ourselves today is that the Palestinians have called out to the world to do exactly this kind of direct action. So it's not as though Palestine Action somehow spontaneously decided one day to blockade Israeli weapons factories. It is, in fact, that the Palestinian people, and again, huge broad-based groups of unions, have put out calls internationally to say, as the international solidarity movement, we want you to challenge Israeli weapons manufacture and exports from your own country. So the Palestinian people called out to the people of Britain to materially break the supply chain of Israeli weapons, and groups like Palestine Action answered that call. So really, this is, for me, one of the purest and most inspiring examples of autonomous, broad-based ground up experiments in direct democracy that are, on the one hand, while at the same time it's it's providing a model for alternative forms of democracy in this country, it's also building a very powerful and very effective international group of movements that are willing to put their own liberty on the line in order to participate, for the privilege, I would say, of participating in the liberation movement of the Palestinians. And I'll end just by focusing on this word effective, because I believe the reason we're seeing such unprecedented pressure from the state, like we said, limiting freedom of speech, also criminalizing certain words, these are really fascistic tactics that we're seeing from the British government. The gross misuse of anti-terrorism legislation, and the willingness to put even non-violent protesters, as we saw with, for example, Just Stop Oil, in prison for 4 or 5 years. The reason, I believe, is a very profound sense of fear on behalf of the state, because they've seen that masses of people are no longer afraid of the state's threats of violence, and they're no longer afraid of the state's threats of quote unquote justice. And the fact that now the state has seen that has put it in a real panic. So although the situation seems very grim, and in many ways it is, but Palestine Action has been incredibly effective in materially cutting off the supply of weapons to Israel. And the proof, I think, is in the government's overreaction.